Gonzaga got a taste of what road trips in the new Pac-12 are going to look like, and it's clear this team still has some work to do to be prepared.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL playoffs are almost here, and it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, because right now new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, the Zags fall in overtime Thursday night to Oregon State despite a Herculean effort from Graham Ike. We're going to discuss the good from that game. Yes, there was plenty of good things that happened in this game. I know some folks maybe not feeling that way right now. Understandable. There's some bad things. We're going to talk plenty about that, about Khalif Battle's rough night, about Gonzaga's inability to handle a very raucous road environment. We're going to talk about those things. We're also going to get you ready for Saturday's game at home against the Broncos of Santa Clara. We'll start with how this game went. Gonzaga falls in overtime at Oregon State. 97-89 is the final score as the first matchup between these two schools since 1991. Oregon State holds a massive advantage in this series. I was going to say rivalry. It's not yet a rivalry, although I do think that a game like this, a very emotional game, a lot of conversation on the court, a lot of conversation in the crowd, in the stands, could potentially develop a rivalry, especially as these two teams continue to be in the same conference going forward. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show. But obviously for Gonzaga, another tough loss in a season that has been all too full of tough losses for this club. Again, I had people say this is going to be a hard game to find good things. Not really. There were actually quite a few good things for Gonzaga, just more bad things, which was the problem. Graham Ike was phenomenal in this game. I mean, he was absolutely, the stats don't even really fully encapsulate how great he was for Gonzaga in this game. They don't even come close to winning this basketball game without him. And that's a problem. That in itself is not exactly a good thing, but it is good that Graham, at some points single-handedly, was the reason that Gonzaga was even in this game in the first place. He very clearly was the only reason Gonzaga was in overtime in this game, because he hit that three-pointer with 3 seconds left when Gonzaga was down 3 to send it to overtime in the first place. He finished this game with 26 points, 9 boards, and an assist. He was 9 of 14 from the field, including 7 of 8 from the free throw line. And folks, we were sitting next to some Oregon State fans who were very loud, who were yelling at the Gonzaga players, yelling things that would get you kicked out of most arenas in the WCC, but things they let you get away with at a school like Oregon State. And I wish more than anything that I could take a photo of the faces that they made when Graham Ike hit that three. You couldn't tell professional actors to look stunned, and they wouldn't be able to do it better than those kids did. It was chef's kiss. They got the last laugh. So kudos to them. There's no hate here. I loved every second of it. But man, that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and one of the most incredibly clutch shots in Gonzaga regular season history. It did not result in a win, of course, so it's going to get washed away. Understandably, doesn't really matter if you don't end up winning the basketball game. But man, that was something else. Graham, great game all across the board, continued to score in one-on-one coverage, didn't have too many turnover issues. He had a couple of them, but that's going to happen in a game like this. Didn't put himself in foul trouble. He did foul out of this game, but he was never really in foul trouble. He picked up his 4th foul in overtime, and few left him in because, as we'll talk about in a second, Braden Huff was pretty much unplayable in this game. So Graham does foul out, but it wasn't a game where he put himself in a position where he was able to play pretty much the entire second half and most of overtime. And that's not something he's been able to do very much this season. It was a phenomenal performance from Graham, worthy of plenty of praise in a game where there wasn't a whole lot else to really celebrate. I will say this, one of the feedback that I've seen people talk about this on social media. I've had some people respond to me and talk about this. Gonzaga's had trouble with zones this year. I say this year as if Gonzaga hasn't had trouble with zones as long as I can remember. The first year, I was a super significant Gonzaga fan with my freshman year. They lost to Syracuse in the NCAA tournament because they couldn't play. They didn't have a zone offense. Like, this has been a consistent problem in Mark Few's entire tenure. But this specific game, Coach Tinkle at Oregon State, they were constantly switching defenses. For a while in the first half, it was every possession, alternate zone, man. They had a 2-3 zone, they had a 3-2 zone. They were alternating between all of them. And it was intentionally done to try to confuse Gonzaga and get them to take a little bit longer to get into their sets and do what they wanted to do to kind of throw them out of the rhythm. And it worked. It worked. But Gonzaga's actual ability to score on the zone was pretty good in this game. And I thought that was interesting that so many people kind of immediately defaulted to, oh, well, Mark Few doesn't know how to run a zone offense. I still think Gonzaga has issues with the zone offense, but they weren't issues in this game. Nolan Hickman hit 3 threes against the zone late in the first half. We saw Gonzaga get a bunch of offensive rebounds. They had 19 offensive rebounds in this game. One of the best things you can do against a zone is rebound. Get offensive rebounds, because players have a much harder time boxing out in a zone defense. So if you crash the offensive glass, if you get out in transition and you hit open threes, you shoot over the zone, those are the ways to beat the zone. Gonzaga did all of those things. And to the point, I don't think Oregon State ran zone for a single possession in the second half of this game. They were unable to continue to run their zone defense, to continue to do their switching between different defenses in the second half of this game because of how effective Gonzaga was against the zone in the first half. That was an area of strength for Gonzaga in a game where they didn't have a lot of strengths, and in a game where it's not typically something that they do well. So I thought that they deserve some credit for how they handled that in the first half. Great game from Ben Gregg, 15 points, 13 rebounds, 8 of them offensive. He is an offensive rebounding machine. He also had 4 assists and 2 steals. He was 5 of 8 on twos. He was only 0 of 4 or 1 of 4 from 3, but the 3 that he did hit was a very clutch one. Another 3 that was critical to Gonzaga even being in overtime in this game. The Zags were also 20 of 25, which is good 80% from the free throw line. All right, let's talk about the bad stuff. And don't worry, bad stuff's going to be the rest of this segment and pretty much all of the next segment. One of the biggest problems for Gonzaga in this game, quite clearly, was that they got virtually nothing from their bench. Dusty Stromer had 5 points. He was 2 of 3 from the field, so it wasn't an inefficient night, but he had 4 fouls, which limited him to just 15 minutes. When your best perimeter defensive player, a critical player on this roster, offensively and most notably defensively, puts himself in a position where he cannot play more than 15 minutes in an overtime game, that is hugely problematic. So many of the issues Gonzaga ran into late in this game, even possessions where they defended well and Oregon State hit tough shots, which frankly, that happened a lot. A lot of Oregon State's offensive possessions were 29 seconds, shooting a 3 over a contested defensive player and making it. At some point, you tip your cap to Oregon State. But on the other hand, DeMarco Minor making a 6-foot guard, DeMarco Minor making a 3-pointer over Nolan Hickman while Hickman was defending him well. I don't know if he makes that shot over Dusty because he's 3 inches taller. So Dusty not being on the floor, that's a huge problem for Gonzaga. And then Braden Huff. Wow. Braden Huff was really rough in this game. 4 points, 2 of 7 shooting. He was 0 of 1 from 3. He had 2 rebounds, 2 fouls in 11 minutes. He played 11 minutes. And the reason being, not just that he went 2 of 7, although that is obviously a factor, when he was getting decent looks and just could not get him to go through the net, but he was terrible defensively in this game. He got cooked every single time. Parsifala, the big man for Oregon State, who had very good footwork and was a good low post player, he couldn't do much on Graham Ike, but he scored at will on Braden Huff. When Braden got switched and was playing on guards, they just went right past him. There's one possession where one of Oregon State's guards, Lilivicus, I think is how you pronounce his name. They said it a bunch of times and still struggled with it. Regardless, he had a possession where he drove right past Braden and then ended up passing it because they were trying to burn clock. They didn't want to score that easily, basically. And then they got him the ball later in the possession, and he made the exact same move and went straight to the rim and scored. I'm like, what are we doing? Like, Braden's never been a great defensive player, but he becomes completely unplayable in games where he's also not scoring around the rim. He was genuinely unplayable in this game. And again, that's why you give credit to Graham for putting himself in a position where he could stay in the game until the final 90 seconds or so of the game when he ended up fouling out. And Braden did score in that period of time, but he also gave up points on the defensive end. 9 total points from the bench. Again, 5 from Stromer. And going back to Stromer, he had the 4 fouls. He didn't have any other stats. No rebounds, no assists, no steals, no blocks, nothing. For Huff, unplayable because of his defense. Mike Lejayi played well defensively, didn't miss a lot of shots, but he didn't make any either. 0 of 2 from the field, so did not score in this game. He had 3 boards, a block, and a steal. He had 2 fouls in 15 minutes. Fouling was an issue for everybody on the bench. Fouling was an issue for pretty much everybody in the starting lineup, too. Oregon State got to the line, I think, 37 times in this game. Maybe a little home cooking, but not in a way that impacted the result of the game. But the fouling was an issue, and the bench contributing mostly just fouls was a huge factor for Gonzaga not winning this game. The Zags were 7 of 15 from 3 in the first half. Mentioned that because that was when Wayne Tinkle and Oregon State were running that zone. When they decided to go man, basically Gonzaga let Graham completely cook in the second half and in overtime. But the problem was when they did need to make 3-point shots, they couldn't do it. 2 of 6 in the second half, which is not 33%. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's only 6 3-point attempts. But then 0 of 4 from 3 in overtime. That's when you needed them. You couldn't get them. Really rough to see Gonzaga start the game out shooting so well from 3 and then have it completely vanish after that. Also, Ryan Nembhard, it's kind of hard to know where to put him because when you look at the box score, for anybody who didn't watch this whole game, if you're an East Coaster and just woke up to the box score, you'll see he had 13 points, 10 assists, and 6 rebounds. You'll be like, well, that was pretty good. That's getting within the conversation of getting a triple-double. That's a darn good basketball game, right? Well, he was 2 of 3 from 3, which is great. That's great for Ryan, a guy who struggled massively as a 3-point shooter early last year. He was 1 of 7 on 2-point attempts. 1 of 7. Ryan's never been great at finishing around the rim. That's not exactly his game, but 1 of 7. Some of them were those little mid-range jumpers that he typically has a high success rate on, and he just missed them. There weren't a lot of terrible shots. There was a few questionable decisions by him, but most of the time he was getting decent looks and they just weren't falling. When your point guard, who has the ball in his hands as much as he does, goes 1 of 7 on 2-pointers, that's a really, really brutal stat line in a way that was significant for Gonzaga not winning this basketball game and contributed to the last point I'm going to make here before we talk about some of the other things in this game in the second segment, which is that Gonzaga shot 21 of 47 on 2-pointers. That's 44%. That's not very good, especially not for Gonzaga. But if you take out Ike, if you remove Graham's 2-pointers, this team shot 13 of 34 from 2-pointers. That's 38.2%. That is atrocious. Gonzaga's 2-point offense. We already talked about the threes, good in the first half, bad pretty much the rest of the game, 2 of 10 after the first half. But the 3-point shooting, the 2-point shooting being under 40% for non-Graham Ike players, hugely problematic for Gonzaga, not just in this game and not just the key reason they lost, but a problem for Gonzaga going forward if they can't be more efficient around the rim on everybody on this roster. Although, again, Graham, certainly not the problem in this one. Well, folks, we didn't talk about Khalif Battle because we're going to spend a lot more time talking about Khalif Battle here in the second segment. He needed to show up in this game, and frankly, he didn't. Looks like some emotions got the best of him. There were some compounding mistakes, things that we've seen from him throughout the year that you just want to see cleaned up for a guy at this point in the season and a guy who's in his 6th year of college basketball. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the road struggles for Gonzaga, all that coming up in just a second. But first, a word from PrizePicks, the place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings, PrizePicks has changed the game in daily fantasy sports. Whether it's the playoffs or regular season, PrizePicks has made it easier than ever to win big while enjoying all the football action. Here's how it works. You simply pick more or less on at least 2 players. And if your picks hit, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. That's right, 1,000 times your money just by making a few simple picks. I had a 2-player pick for Thursday, Khalif Battle over 13.5 points, which he hit. 15 points. Unfortunately, Stefan Todorovic needed to get 23.5 or more, 24 points, rebounds, and assists. He got 22, so I just missed winning what would have been $90 on a $30 bet. It's very, very fun to do. Not a lot of college games tonight on Friday, but if you want into the NBA, the Lakers playing the Nets tonight. Rui Hachimura over under 11.5 points. Brooklyn gives up a bunch of points. I would not be surprised to see Rui getting in the 12, 15-point range. If you like that bet, plenty of other ones on there. It's fun and to predict. It's easy to play. Plus, with PrizePicks' flex play, you can still double your money even if one of your picks doesn't hit. And with the app, you get your winnings fast, sometimes in as little as 15 minutes. So download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Don't wait. Take your game to the next level with PrizePicks. Run your game. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still talking about Gonzaga's loss on Thursday night. 3 ranked teams play on Thursday. All 3 of them lost. I had a real sickly feeling when we got to the arena and we'd seen that Memphis had already lost to Temple and that Minnesota beat Michigan on a half-court shot from Dawson Garcia in overtime. It was like, oh, I usually don't feel like there's a jinx or anything like that, but it was an uneasy feeling. And of course, ends up being the case where all 3 ranked teams go down. We're going to talk about the keys that we laid out prior to the game, some of which you've already kind of touched on, so we'll kind of breeze past. And then a few that I want to really focus on that were significant factors in this game. Key number 1 for Gonzaga was to set the tempo right away. They struggled to do this. I don't think it played a significant role in the game, but it was something that they had 11 fast break points. That's not terrible. That's not awful. They've had games with worse. And I think the reason that I don't feel like this was a huge inhibitor for them is because one of the things that Oregon State, and a lot of teams do this against Gonzaga because they know that every time they get a rebound, they want to run. They want to go, they want to get out, and they want to try to score in transition as soon as possible. So a lot of teams will basically not attempt to get any offensive rebounds. They will accept being one and done on offense. You take your shot, you get back on defense. If you missed a shot, it's okay. Gonzaga's going to get the rebound, and you just get back. And so Oregon State did not get. They only had 3 offensive rebounds. They didn't make any real effort to try to get on the offensive glass. So for Gonzaga, the pressure that they put on the opposing team because of how effective they are at getting out in transition actually works in their favor, even in games where they don't get out in transition that much, because the other team is working so hard to not let them get out in transition that they're giving up their chance to get second chance opportunities. So it kind of feels, I don't want to say it washes out necessarily. I think if Gonzaga had been able to play at a tempo that they're more comfortable with, I think that could have helped them in this game. So I do think Oregon State being able to slow the Zags down was effective. But I also think that it comes with some bad things for Oregon State and some things that Gonzaga was able to take advantage of by gobbling up rebounds at a really high rate in this game. Key number 2 was for Gonzaga to score a lot of points off turnovers. And this wasn't a factor because one of the things that Oregon State does a lot of is turn the basketball over in ways that aren't steals. Non-steal turnover rate was really high. They do a lot of traveling violations, shot clock violations, those kinds of things. And in this game, they just didn't. They just didn't. Some of that is maybe Gonzaga not being able to put enough pressure and not being able to draw offensive fouls and things like that. But you can't force the other team to travel. You can't force the other team to throw the ball out of bounds. Like, you can play good defense, and Gonzaga played decent defense. They had issues defensively. I don't want to say it was great defense. They gave up 97 points, but Oregon State had 9 turnovers in this game. 7 of them were steals by Gonzaga. 7 steals for Gonzaga is pretty good. That's not a bad number for them, but that means that Oregon State only had 2 turnovers that were not steals. That's it. Some of that is issues with Gonzaga not putting enough pressure on them defensively. Some of that, I think, is just Oregon State playing a pretty clean basketball game, having a good strategy coming into the game. There's a little bit of home being at home, I think, helps with some of that too. But it's an area where I would have liked to see Gonzaga take more advantage. But some of it is just a bit of a hat tip to Oregon State for taking good care of the basketball in this one. Key number 3, huge factor in this game. Find a way to handle Mikey Ratai. He was incredible for Oregon State in this game. 29 points. He was 9 of 15 from the field and 2 of 3 from 3. Both those threes came in overtime. He was 9 of 10 from the free throw line. He had 7 boards, 2 assists, a block, and a steal. Like I said, he had both his threes in overtime. He had a ridiculous up and under shot around Ike that had no business going in, but it did. He had a bunch of free throws in overtime. He was excellent. He was excellent in this game. Absolutely excellent. He's a very likely WCC Player of the Year candidate. All WCC players pretty much locked up now after this performance. Really good player, and he killed Gonzaga in this game. Key number 4 was to get Khalif Battle more involved offensively. And at this point, this is on Khalif. I know people, every time Gonzaga loses, people want me to be more critical of the coaching staff. Wasn't a perfectly coached game by Mark Few by any stretch, but I think a lot of the issues in this game were personnel, players not playing well. Braden Huff played crappy. Gonzaga, Mark Few stopped playing Braden Huff. Dusty Stromer played crappy. Gonzaga stopped playing Dusty Stromer. Like, what, on some level, there's just not a coaching issue in that game. They handled the zone defense pretty well. They went to Graham Ike constantly offensively. Like, there was just a lot of stuff that this team is not built to win games and win close games without the personnel that they have. Khalif Battle was supposed to be that guy. He's not that guy. That's the problem. In this game where I thought he could have taken advantage by constantly going to the rim, getting to the free throw line, he wasn't able to do it. He finished the game with 15 points, 3 of 6 on 2-pointers. Fine. 1 of 7 from 3, 6 of 6 from the free throw line. I don't really like any of that. I would have liked 10 free throw attempts. I would have liked half as many 3-point attempts. 1 of 7 from 3. Why are you settling for threes? You're a 35% career 3-point shooter in 5 years of college basketball. Go to the dang basket. Like, we don't need you to be doing that. Like, in the zone, there was a few threes that were fine. Like, not every 3-point attempt that he took was bad, but like, they're going to let you do that because they know how good you are at getting to the rim. You got to find a way to get through that. If you can't, that's a huge problem. Beyond the shot selection, which I thought was a huge issue for Battle and for Gonzaga in this game, he also had 3 turnovers and 2 fouls. That's not terrible. Again, Graham Ike had 3 turnovers and 5 fouls, but for Battle, you can tell he gets frustrated and he compounds mistakes. You can see it. You can see him get overly anxious. He gets a steal. He gets out in transition. He immediately drives into 2 players instead of coughing it up or instead of slowing it down, commits a turnover on his own. That's what happened. He went into contact, assumed he'd get fouled, didn't get the call, threw his hands up at the referees and turned the basketball over. Like, at some point, he's been in college for 6 years. Like, you gotta start being able to reel a guy in like that. And again, if you want some criticism of Mark Few, he hasn't been able to do that. This is a player who one of the first things Mark Few said about Khalif Battle, we never had a player like this. He's absolutely right. That should be a positive thing. And they're struggling to figure out how to acclimate him. And some of that's on the coaching staff, and some of that is on Khalif to acclimate, like to go play to his strengths. If the coaching staff is telling him to take 7 threes and 6 2-point attempts per game, that is absolutely a coaching issue. If he's choosing to do that and the coaches are not coming down on him for that, are not coaching him, are not educating him on, hey, this is why we want you to do this instead, then it's still a coaching issue. But at the end of the day, a game where Khalif Battle could have probably won this game for Gonzaga, instead he did the opposite. And it was a brutal thing to watch happen because I know how good he is when he plays his best. I know how capable this player is, and he didn't look anywhere close to that in this game. Key number 5, talked about it a little bit already. We'll talk about it more later because we're running out of time already. It's a new arena. It's a new place to play, a new road environment for everybody who's ever played at Gonzaga, for Mark Few, for the staff. This is a new place. The last time they played this team was 1991. It has been a long time. This is not a road game at Firestone Fieldhouse in Pepperdine. Sorry to my friends who are Pepperdine fans. It's not a road game, to 120 miles up north in Portland. It's not that. Not a road game at the Child Center. This place was packed. I know many of you were there. Many of you said hi to me. I appreciate that. This place was packed. It was packed with people wearing orange and black, and it was loud. It was so freaking loud in that place. I'm surprised I have a voice. I don't a little bit. You can kind of hear it because I was yelling in my dad's ear every time I wanted to talk to him. That place was rocking and bumping and loud, and people screaming at Gonzaga players, screaming at Coach Few, screaming at everybody. Gonzaga don't face this much. I remember when Gonzaga lost to Washington last year, one of the talking points we had after that game was that Dusty Stromer and Braden Huff both really struggled because it was their first true road game. We thought, okay, that's understandable. They're freshmen. I know Huff is a redshirt freshman, but it was his first road game. It's a road game against a power conference team. There was a bunch of people in that crowd. There's energy between these two schools, and those players who are young and not experienced with that struggled. It's not an excuse anymore. Those same 2 players struggled here. It's not an excuse anymore. You got to be better at it. You got to be able to handle it. It's definitely not an excuse for Khalif Battle. This dude played in the SEC. You got to be able to handle this. There's nothing anybody said to him in this game that's worse than what he heard from Kentucky fans. There's no chance. You have to be able to handle that. The players who handled it on the floor in this game, Graham Ike, who played in the Mountain West, I know it's not a power conference, but he's at least somewhat familiar with some hostile road environments. He's used to it. Ben Gregg played well because he's just a really composed, collected guy. Hickman and Nemhard played well because they're seniors. They've done this before. Again, Nemhard also didn't play all that great, but those guys could handle it. But Dusty and Braden were not ready for this environment. Mike Ajayi, I don't know. He played about how he's been playing lately. He's just not the player that we need him to be or that we expected him to be at this point. But the players that needed to play well in this game who didn't, they didn't seem like they could handle this environment. And let me tell you something right now. This is what all the environments are going to look like. This is it. This is the thing now. After this upcoming year, Gonzaga's road environments are Oregon State and Washington State. We haven't seen Pullman yet, but I'll tell you right now, it's going to be just as bad as that. And then you get San Diego State. We know what that looks like. At least we have some familiarity there. It's going to be loud at Colorado State. It's going to be loud at Boise State. I don't know about Fresno State. We'll see, but it's going to be bigger. It's going to be bigger than the arenas Gonzaga plays at. Like I think this is a good thing for Gonzaga. I think it's a wake-up call for Gonzaga that you're going to need to be ready for this, because those places are going to be loud. And there's going to be a lot. I mean, half the road crowds in the WCC walk into that arena expecting their team to lose. Oregon State did not expect to lose this basketball game. The fan base did not expect to lose this basketball game. Or if they did, they sure as heck didn't show it. And it resulted in a W for them. Gonzaga needs to figure out how to play in these hostile road environments, because they've always played neutral site games in the regular season or in the non-conference. They play neutral sites in the NCAA tournament, and then they lose road games. You've got to be able to play in hostile road environments. I'm glad Oregon State showed them that that's something they need to work on, because they got 2 years to get it figured out. Well, Gonzaga heads back home. No more road games for a little bit. At least they're going to face Santa Clara on Saturday evening. We're going to meet this Bronco team that we've kind of already met. A lot of some familiar faces for Coach Herb Sendek. We're going to talk about that coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's keep on tackling the college hoops action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $250 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. Zags 13.5-point favorites, opening up the FanDuel lines against Santa Clara. I know it's tempting to bet the under, but I kind of think Gonzaga is going to play a little pissed off, and they're going to be back home. They're going to be pissed because they lost that game to Oregon State. Wouldn't be surprised if they cover that line. If you like that line, if you like any of the other lines, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, $250 in bonus bets, and that's not just if you win, folks. That is whether you win or lose. If you put down a $5 bet, you get $250 in bonus bets guaranteed. FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 3, closing out the show, getting you ready for Saturday night's game at the McCarthy Athletic Center against the Broncos of Santa Clara, January 18th, 6 p.m. The game will be on ESPN Plus. Again, we've been smooth sailing with ESPN Plus as of late. So if you're in the Seattle area, Fox 13 Plus. If you're in the Spokane region, it's KHQ. Anywhere else, you should be able to get this game on ESPN Plus. The Zags split with Santa Clara last year, losing that game on the road. It was around this same time last year, so we can kind of hope that Gonzaga's loss to Oregon State is the low point of the season and that they'll kind of roll from here on out like they did last year. We got to hope on that, because that is where we're at in the season at this point. The Broncos 12-7 overall, 4-2 to start conference play. They lost their most recent game on Thursday to LMU. That was a 57-54 final. They also lost to San Francisco in their first conference game. That was an overtime loss back on December 30th. A very, very frustrating loss for Santa Clara. They were tied with less than a second left. Christoph Tilley at the free throw line, 1-1, literally just needed to make the first free throw, and that game was over. He missed it, and they went into overtime, and San Francisco won. It was a really auspicious start for the Broncos this year. They began the year 1-3, and in fact lost 5 of their first 8 games. This is a team with a ton of roster continuity, one of the most continuous rosters, 8th. They have the 8th most roster continuity of any Division I team in college basketball, according to Ken Pom. When that happens and you start the season losing games you're not expected to lose, that's pretty unusual. It was a strange, surprising start to the year for Santa Clara. They lost to Arizona State. They lost to North Dakota State at home. They lost to Nevada. They lost to Stanford. They lost to Washington. But they've also beat some good teams. They beat St. Louis. They beat UC Riverside. They beat TCU, McNeese, and Bradley. They also have a win over Oregon State, who they beat in overtime. They also beat San Francisco. They split the series with the Dons, beat them by 23 the other time that they played them. So a really comfortable win over a good San Francisco team. Ken Pom right now has the Broncos 72nd in the country. Adjusted offensive efficiency is 58th. However, much more challenged on the defensive end of the floor, 102nd there. Their tempo, 149th, so right in the middle of the country. And like I said, team is almost exactly the same as last year. They return Adama Alpha-Ball. They return Christoph Tilley. They return Tyree Bryan. They return Johnny O'Neal. They return Cameron Tongue. Those were some of their best players last year. All of them are back in the mix. They also add back Carlos Stewart, one of their key additions in the transfer portal this offseason, but it's a unique addition because he started his career at Santa Clara, played with Brandon Pajemski on that really good Santa Clara team a few years ago, hit the transfer portal, went to LSU. Things didn't go very well for him at LSU, so he called Coach Sendek and said, I want to come back. That's what Coach Sendek told me at WCC Media Days. They basically weren't planning to use the transfer portal at all. And Carlos Stewart said, I want to come back. And they said, yeah, okay, great. You averaged 15 points per game for us last time you were here. Like, we'd love to have you back. So that's how they get him back. They made one other addition, Elijah Mahi out of the junior college ranks. He's been very good for Coach Sendek and the Broncos, 12.6 points, 4 boards, 2 assists, shooting 40.5% from 3, although that is on just 2 3-point attempts per game. A couple other things to know on this Santa Clara team. Their average height is 26th in the country, meaning they are just about one of the 25 tallest teams on average in college basketball. They utilized this to their advantage in that road game against Gonzaga last year, kind of tried to bully up on Hickman and Nembhard with Adama Alpha-Ball. Carlos Stewart is a bigger guard as well. So that is something to keep an eye on. They have big guards. They have big players in the front court. Johnny O'Neal's a 3 and he's 6'9". Christoph Tilly, I think, is 6'11", 7 foot, somewhere right in that range. This is a team that has a lot of size, a lot of length, and they know how to utilize it. That'll be a key part of this game. They also average 28 3-point attempts per game. That's the 37th highest mark in the country. So they shoot a ton of threes, but they're not very good at it. It's kind of odd. 34.2% on the season. That's 164th in the country. It's not terrible, but it's also not very good. If you're going to be in the top 40 in terms of 3-point attempts per game, you probably want to shoot at least in the top 150 among 3-point shooting per game. And especially when you look at the flip side of this, which is they are 55% on 2-pointers, which is 80th. Again, it's not elite, but it's pretty darn good. And yet they only take 33.6 2-point attempts per game, which is 262nd. So a team that shoots a lot of threes, a team that doesn't shoot nearly as many twos, and yet a team that is a far more efficient team on 2-pointers than 3-pointers. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should flip this. That's not exactly how it works. They're probably efficient on 2-pointers because of how many threes they take, etc. But it is still notable when talking about the stats for this team that's kind of the spread with regards to their 2-point and 3-point shooting. Also, we talked about them being not a very good defensive team. Their steal rate is 9%. That is 241st in the country, so they're not generating a ton of steals. Their block rate, 8.9%. That's 189th in the country, so they're not blocking a lot of shots, not generating a lot of steals. Keys for the game, we'll just do them real quick here. Defend the perimeter. Obviously, a team that 28 3-point attempts per game. They only shoot 34%, but if they shoot at that rate or even higher than that, they're going to make 10 threes. If you let this team make 10 threes, that could be a problem for you in the win column. So you got to defend the perimeter. You can't have Dusty playing 15 minutes with 4 fouls. He needs to be a bigger part of the game plan. He needs to, I'm sure he was a bigger part of the game plan against Oregon State. He needs to put himself in a position where he can play 25 minutes in this game, because if he can, he's going to be on the floor for 25 minutes. This is a game where I expect him to play more than Nolan Hickman, provided he doesn't shoot himself in the foot by getting in foul trouble, because the size difference is critical against this team. Don't be afraid to attack with guards instead of force-feeding the bigs. This team has a lot of size, a lot of length. Graham Ike has been playing great, and I think he should absolutely be option number 1. But if it's not there, be willing to do other stuff. Don't get too predictable offensively. Find other ways. I know we've criticized Khalif Battle a lot in this show, but if you can get him going downhill, you can get him going to the rim, I think you got to do it. Khalif's got to make the decision to do that himself. If he's settling for a bunch of jumpers, you might have to make a change. I think you need Khalif in this game because of his size as a guard, but you got to find ways to score that aren't just settling for getting the ball to Graham and hoping he can make something happen. And then crash the glass. Big team. Got to win the rebounding advantage, especially at home. Got to get second chance opportunities. Got to limit second chance opportunities for Santa Clara. Got to win the battle on the boards. This is an area of strength for Gonzaga this season, but it has to be in a game against this Santa Clara team if you want to come away with a W and avoid a catastrophic 2-game losing streak in conference play. It's going to wrap it up for me today and for this week. We'll be back on Monday recapping Gonzaga's win. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll be recapping Gonzaga's game against Santa Clara on Saturday. We'll also get you ready for the rest of the week. There's no more games during the week next week until they play at Portland on Saturday. We'll also get you up to date on what's going on with the women's team. Yvonne Ejim, incredible performance against Portland on Thursday. We'll talk about that next week as well. Thanks again, folks, for listening. And even coming off of a tough loss like that, as always, every episode, go Zags.